This is Coffee with Kelly, a dynamic podcast that's dedicated to driving positive change in school safety. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Kelly Moore, Senior School Safety Specialist for Crisis Go. Our mission is to empower you with essential knowledge, tools, and inspiration required to foster a safer and more secure school environment. We hope this podcast will be the catalyst for transformation in your schools. Join us as we continue to dive into the world of school safety. Good morning, Kelly, and good morning, Jason. Again, what is this, like podcast number 3, Jason?
He's almost a regular.
Yeah, he's like a thing now.
I think the third one. Yeah.
I almost don't even need to do an intro, but
we should.
Jason, I'm gonna open up the floor for you to do an intro. Just give us high level, who you are, what you're about, all that.
Well, good morning, Ethan and Kelly. It is a pleasure to be back and an honor to sit with you guys again. My name is Jason Stoddard. I'm the Director of Safety and Security for the Charles County Public Schools. We're located about 20 minutes south of Washington, D.C. We have about 28,000 students, 5,000 employees spread across 43 schools and centers. I'm also the chairperson for the National Council of School Safety Directors, which honored to have Kelly that sits next to me on the Leadership Council for that. Been doing this job for about 7 years after retiring from a local law enforcement organization and still learning every day.
Sometimes those lessons are forced down your throat, aren't they?
Unfortunately.
Yeah. So I guess that leads us into kind of why we're here. I look at it as a learning opportunity. So Jason has been willing to come on here and talk about a recent event. I'll open up that to you, and you can just start us off, and maybe I'm sure Kelly or I will chime in, and we'll try to go kind of in order, I guess, and try to just tackle it piece by piece. And this is for the purpose of basically anyone else that wants to listen and learn from this, right? That's the whole point, is we have these open conversations and just help others to grow and learn in this crazy space that we're in.
Yeah, so this is the space that we're in. It can feel very lonely, and without organizations such as ours and podcasts such as this and having these conversations, I think those of us who are in the school security space, and specifically school security directors that have to deal with these very unique situations and the community fallout and the emotions that deal with them, having outlets to be able to share these things, and having school security directors talk to school security directors and make school security directors better is ultimately what we're always after. And it's not a commercial or anything else. It's just, hey, these are the things that are going on in the real world and the realities that we face every day. So what started this was your last podcast. I think you opened up with a article about a shooting in an elementary school classroom in suburban Virginia. As I was listening to that, as you guys were recording it that morning, we actually had one in our jurisdiction. We had a fourth grader that brought a .357 Magnum into his classroom. The gun was fired in the fourth grade classroom at about 9:30 in the morning during morning announcements. He had it in his backpack. It went through his backpack, through his chair, onto the floor. In our specific case, there was 23 juveniles in the classroom, and there were at least 23 juveniles in the classroom, and 3 adults. Not one person reported that they heard a gunshot, which makes this very, very unique in the fact that add this to you won't believe this actually happens. And for anybody to believe that your first thought would be in a fourth grade classroom at 9:30 in the morning that a gunshot was made, that's just not reality. So what was reported was people heard what sounded like a balloon pop, smelled a little bit of smoke, and their initial reaction was that a light had blown or something along those lines. It was not confirmed to be a shooting for roughly 30 minutes. There was a SRO on site when the event happened. There's an SRO that works in this specific elementary school. They were involved in the investigation as soon as they started to put things together. Then, of course, you have the questions that come. Well, why didn't you go into lockdown? How fast did we respond to it? Did we let the community know what was going on? What's the community reaction been? Because obviously this is scary. It's emotional. And this happened 2 days before we went to spring break. And then unfortunately, shortly 3 days after spring break, we recovered a P80 3D printed ghost gun with 13 rounds of ammunition at a high school after a stop. So our community is reeling with the fact that we've had one shooting in elementary school and a recovery of a handgun at a high school shortly thereafter. And I think in our line of work with what we do, because we deal with parents, we deal with their babies. We're there to do everything we can do to protect their babies. This is an important conversation to have, so that people understand, so that everybody who does this job or thinks that they're an expert in this field because they're a parent or because they spent 14 years in a public school and they know how schools operate. Every situation is unique. You can't pigeonhole the response or how people behave into one idea. And I think in many cases, when these conversations occur, people try and lump everything into one thing, and understanding that the threat matrix that schools face is enormous. And this is just yet again another issue that you wouldn't believe could occur. But here in this particular case, it's happened twice within 50 miles of each other on the East Coast, one in Maryland and one in Virginia. And prior to that, I think you'd be struggle to find any of these types of situations, and very few of these situations in an elementary school. Our school district's been around for 106 years. This is the first shooting that we've ever had in a school that we can find. The fact that we weren't perfect at the response, which we weren't, and no one is, while we always have things to learn, it's likely a good thing that we weren't perfect at it, because that means we haven't done it all the time. And these situations you have to deal with the situation that you have in front of you, not what you may or may not believe at the time. You have to deal with what you have in front of you, and putting responses, the initial response to this, in any type of a formal checklist can lead you down the wrong directions. I think we have to look at things from framework ideas and from foundational principle ideas versus here's the checklist, we got to follow it.
There's a lot to unpack there, right? And some of the questions are obviously going to be, how did he get it into the school? Why didn't you do X, Y, and Z? And we've talked about that, and we've talked about the expense, the practicality of that. We've talked about that ad nauseum in the past. The real thing that, strikes me is the lack of recognition. If anyone has ever heard a 357 short barrel weapon fired,
I would be loud.
that's not a subtle sound.
That's gonna be loud.
Even in a backpack, I wouldn't think, right? How do we, and I'm asking this question specifically because I know of one state who has actually outlawed this. How do we get teachers, staff members to recognize the report of a firearm? Or how do we get them to look at worst case scenario and take an action that is related to, let's make the assumption that popping was a gun first, regardless of what it is, then what are some of the appropriate actions? How do we get to that point?
So, and I think there's a lot to unpack with that question in itself. I think the idea that that anybody, especially educators who are not cops, are going to immediately recognize gunfire, I don't know if there's any way that we can get to that. Even when you look at mass shootings at big box stores and open air environments, which are far more likely to occur statistically outside of a K-12 space than inside of a K-12 space, those are reported as loud popping noises that very few people ever recognize that they're gunshots right away. The most assumptions that you hear is that they were fireworks, they were books dropping, it was something falling or something along those lines. And that's not unique to school. Then on top of that, this is all part of that human condition. Even with some of the latest statistics, whether you believe them or not, 300 and some odd school shootings in last calendar year. But the definition of school shootings have been changed to include any shooting that occurs on or near schools for the most part. And there's likely a number of different reasons that's occurred. But even with some of those databases, well over 80 to 85% of those occur outside the school walls. So shootings inside of schools are still relatively rare. So I think to get people to automatically believe that without the terrors and the horrors that come from the visual having of victims or people screaming or the immediate recognition because somebody saw the gun, I don't think that it's, quite frankly, that there's a solution to that problem. I think we may like to have it. Mm-hmm. Maybe in this particular case, one could argue that gunshot detection inside of the school could have been helpful, but I don't even know if that would have been the case. You've been around guns as long as I have, and the acoustics of firearms inside of different mediums is definitely different depending on how much stuff was inside of this backpack, depending on, whether it was being held or whether it went off and it went through a bunch of different papers and everything else. It could have muzzled that sound a little bit. Part of that human condition, especially with teachers at the primary school levels, isn't the immediate recognition that, oh, that was a gun. I think they're always going to default to, it's always going to be something else because it's just so unique, so rare.
Doesn't the fact that it is rare, even to have a ballast pop, is rare? We don't have those regularly. And so one of the things, and maybe I'm pushing it to one extreme and maybe I shouldn't be, but if we aren't going to train ourselves to understand what the noises are around us and then how to react when there is not a normal sound, and when there's a sound that's not normal to us, and we choose to go through an investigative process, that generally increases the reactionary gap, right? So if you take the same scenario, just hypothetically, and everyone said, what the hell was that? That could have been a gunshot. I'm going to take this action. Not that it was, but it could have been. This is not appropriate. This is not a normal sound that I'm hearing. It was a loud sound. I'm smelling smoke. May or may not be gunpowder smoke. It may be a ballast. But if we learn to take that action and then we do the investigation, saying, okay, that was only one. Now what? Everyone's protected. And then we find out it was a balloon or a ballast, then we can say, okay, no harm, no foul. But the reverse of that is what concerns me. And if we don't react and we investigate and it was a gun, which in this case, and somebody had some ill intent, then that becomes a problem. Granted, if he had ill intent, people would have figured that out much quicker, right? But
yeah.
I get the hypothetical, but what I'm trying to get to in my mind is that our staff establish a baseline of what normally happens, and when something happens beyond outside of that baseline, an anomaly, rather than try to figure it out and go through those three stages that we've talked about pretty extensively of response to crisis, then I think we're better off if we immediately go, oh, that could have been a gunshot. Let's take an action, calm everything down. Don't get me wrong. I know that it's not going to be a calm environment, but we stabilize everything. Maybe that's a better word. Then we investigate. Then we get people involved in saying, what did you hear? What did you see? What did you smell? What are you touching? What are you feeling? That kind of thing. And then we can at least go through those checklists. Now, I agree, checklists can lead you the wrong way if that's all you're training to. But if you're training to respond and then check to make sure that you've covered things, then that's what those checklists are good for me.
Let me chime in. So do you think that if when we're doing our normal drill schedule, if we had our staff listen to gunshots on YouTube or something like that, would that be enough? I mean, you wouldn't get the smell of it, you wouldn't get the concussion aspect of it, but do we think that would be enough to help train that, or is that still venturing into, we don't want to put our teachers and our staff in that mindset? I'm not asking teachers to go to a gun range and listen to a gunshot. I think that for some could be a little much, but is that too much for the YouTube idea, or I'm just trying to think of anything,
So here's what I'd offer. I think that there's a couple different things at play here. Number one, remember we're dealing with primary school teachers who see the world completely different than all three of us do sitting here. And their worldview isn't wrong. It's just different.
Right.
So,
Right.
and even when you look at tragedies that have occurred, and right off the bat, as I'm sitting here thinking, look at the Route 91 shooting in Vegas. There was probably up to 10 to 15 shots that were fired prior to anyone in that crowd recognizing, to include the artists on the stage, that what they were hearing was gunfire.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the videos that were the compilations of videos that were put together, the audio of gunfire, even outside at that event, you could be standing on one side and hear it clear as day, but standing 5 feet away, and because of angles, not hear a thing. And in that particular case, you're talking about large amounts of automatic gunfire being fired from a high angle. So the acoustics of firearms changes regularly. And I
Hmm.
understand the confusion at the idea that the 357 snub nose was fired in a classroom and no one recognized it. But at the same time, I also think that we have to take into account the worldview of folks, and we also have to take into account the human condition of understanding that no one wants to be the person who cried wolf, and no
Hmm.
one wants to be the person who who opens up the scenario, even though for those of us who do this job, we tell people all the time, look, if we respond to something and it turns out not to be that thing, it's at that point it becomes a great exercise in what we're
Yeah.
doing, the unified command process, the communication process, the response processes, and everything else. That's real difficult for people to understand because nobody wants to be that person that started a chain of events that turns out to be not what it is. And that's another piece of that human condition. I don't know if there's a solution to the what we report potentially as being a problem. And I go back to the idea that we have to respond to what's in front of us, not what we believe is going on. And in this particular case, what was in front of us was the fact that there was an unusual noise that was inside of a classroom with the smell of smoke. And this is no less than the third time since I've been in the schools in 7 years that we've had something that was reported initially as a ballast, or that we found out that it could have been a ballast that exploded. One of the first ones was we had a ballast that exploded at the same time that we had carpet being laid inside of a school that had a noxious smell. And we had the teacher go down in one classroom because of the noxious smell, got sick. And then shortly thereafter, a ballast blew in another classroom that put a strange smell into the air, and another teacher got sick. So now we thought we had an entire hazmat event going on outside of the school that turned out to be a ballast that exploded and
Wow.
carpet glue. Well, we don't think it's abnormal. I think it's more normal than what we potentially believe that it could have been. And we have, again, responding to the event that's in front of us. We knew we had an event that had happened, and they were responding as they would with a unusual noise inside of a classroom, and it took some time to get through it. It's easy to sit back and for us to say, well, they should have done this, could have done this, or could have done that. But again, when we get into these walking through after actions, I think it's important that as we have the discussions, we look at the facts that were known at the time, not assuming one direction or another, because that can make the conversation go in one direction or take it out of the realities. Like you said, Ethan, we have explored the idea of how do we expose people to what those sounds sound like, but then you walk back to, well, it's going to sound different depending on where you are in the building
Yeah. Yeah.
and what your angles are and everything else. Kelly, you mentioned earlier about where school systems have been barred. Last year, Maryland passed a law that put some very stringent restrictions on how we conduct our drills, specifically active shooter drills. We're not allowed with students in the building without permission from parents and going through a bunch of hoops to do full scale active shooter drills that include not only potentially blanks or something along those lines, but moulage or exterior responding officials or anything else, because there is probably some good data that shows that the introduction of those things causes trauma. And is it worth the trauma that it's caused for what you're going to get out of it? Is the return on investment there? Again, not providing any excuses or justifying anything. I'm just saying that I think as we look at these events in the K-12 space, just like we do anywhere else, we have to look at the facts as they knew them at the time as we critique what's going on, and trying to find those solutions or come up with ideas is a great practice. But at the same time, we have to be careful to not point fingers or offend to the people that were there. And that's a real difficult balancing act at times to do.
Right. Yeah, I totally get it. But that being said, I understand if we're going to look at the situation, we have to look at the way that they looked at it from their perspective, their experience, their knowledge, their skills. The problem is, if we're going to accomplish the goal of the parent organization of Zero Now with zero victimization within the schools. If we're going to accomplish that goal, we have to change the ability of and the perception of what is happening in any given situation. You're right. You're absolutely right. The same round being fired from the same gun is going to sound differently from somebody who's directly in front of it versus somebody who's around the corner, who's down the hall, who's on the other side of campus. Totally understand that. But the fact is if we start teaching what is the worst that could happen, what is the worst that this could be, and we take action immediately based upon the worst case scenario, then we de-escalate as we find more facts. So what we have in front of us, the fact set, right when that happens, what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is that's a firearm. What is the proper response to the worst case scenario? And then we start de-escalating based upon the information that we have. Well, maybe that was a balloon. Well, does anyone have a balloon in here? No. Was that a ballast? Well, all of our lights are still working. All of our stuff is still working, so it's not a light. So we're not de-escalating yet. We're not de-escalating from the initial worst case scenario. And I'm not trying to accuse anything or point fingers at. I'm just showing that escalation from the initial perception, you tend to, well, it wasn't this, I don't have this. And you start trying to find a reason why you shouldn't take an action. In Kelly's humble opinion, that causes delays in decisions to call people to take protective actions and so forth. I get it. I totally get it. I'm not sure I would have recognized that in the same situation. It's been a while since I've been to the range. And I totally get, like I said, I get that we have to take them for what they have, but I think we have to make some effort to change that because they are now responsible for our kids, and they are now, and they have been for many, many years. And yet we're still looking at, nobody would have ever thought that there would be a gunshot at 9:30 in a fourth grade class.
Yeah, it's a wake up call.
Well, I think it is a possibility, and we obviously know it's a possibility at this point. I think I would offer this, that when we look at, in our history, we look at law enforcement training, and you know as well as I do that law enforcement training, we're teaching people to think tactically. And sadly, law enforcement has struggled for generations to teach people how to think, not what to think. We teach people basically what the policy book says to do. We teach law enforcement officers what the policy book says to do. But as soon as you ask, why does the policy book say this? They don't know in many cases. And, when we're struggling to teach our first responders in a tactical environment how they need to think, not what they need to think in order to get through those policies, I think when we struggle to do that with cops, we're definitely going to struggle, especially with the limited time that we have with our educators to talk about safety and to train on safety from a threat matrix that is that's enormous, that's complex as you can get. And every one of these situations is completely different. And even with our two situations, we have I'll classify it as a negligent discharge of a firearm inside of a classroom. And then shortly thereafter, 2 weeks later, a handgun that's found in a book bag. Those two things are different. But then add on top of that, if we had the leakage of community gun violence into our schools where a shot was fired over, some community dispute that's going on, that's a completely different, not only response, but also prevention and mitigation strategies to a mass shooting takeover style attack, which we saw at Covington, or we saw in Georgia most recently, or in Wisconsin. All four of those events, while they have a gun involved, are four different things that I think, in my humble opinion, we tend to talk about them all as grouped together, and they're not. One of the things that we're getting a lot of questions from our public about is we were the first organization in the state of Maryland to institute AI-driven gun detection on our cameras. Now, we only have it on our exterior cameras, and every media interview that I did for 6 months about it spoke about how it's not X-ray, it's not predictive, and it only sees and alerts on visible firearm. But now that we've had this tragedy and followed quickly up by another recovery, you get a lot of questions from the public about, well, you're spending all this money on these cameras and they didn't work. Well, that's because that is a mitigation strategy for a very specific event, such as Sandy Hook, Uvalde, even to the extent of Parkland, or where somebody showed up with a weapon on the outside, and that's what that is designed to do. Again, I think it boils back to the enormity of the threat matrix that we face, and being able to utilize the best possible layered strategies that we can to deal with all of those things. Gun violence is arguably is an increasing problem inside of K to 12 spaces, but it's an increasing problem in our country. It's not just something that is just happening in the schools. And I think that we are better served as a profession and as a growing profession in driving those tough conversations with our community and continuing to point to, let's treat the root cause of these situations. I think there's a valid argument for at what level schools need to be involved in pushing responsible and safe gun ownership. And I think there definitely needs to be some boundaries there, but we need some key partnerships from health departments or from law enforcement to help push those, because we end up being the victims of irresponsible or unsafe gun ownership. But then in our case, we were able to identify through the investigation that we had 3 touch points where we had 3 separate students that saw the weapon in the backpack of the student over 2 days before the event happened. And from a school standpoint, my point of prioritization at this point is the idea that we had 3 touch points where we failed. The idea that cultures and climates are the number one preventer of school violence, and this is played out in our case very, very clearly, is the fact that it is not organic for kids to just see something, they know that it's unsafe, and then bring it to a trusted adult in the school, or to even talk to their parents. And I think schools play one of the strategies that I think anybody could learn from this, or the shooting that was in one of our neighboring counties shortly before ours, is the idea that we have to continue to beat the drum for all of our kids, especially at that primary grades, of if you see something that's unsafe, and defining that and then telling them what to do with it. While I get the idea of the response piece, I think that we're going to be limited in the discussion points about what we can do about it and coming up with viable solutions that are reality. But what we can concentrate on is those culture and climate issues. And we need to have a tough conversation about what schools' place is in the responsible gun ownership world, because there has never been a school shooting that I'm aware of where a gun has been legally obtained by a juvenile and used in a felonious way inside of a school. And that's, again, getting back to that gun ownership issue.
I'm not disagreeing, but I am going to point this out, is every situation is individual. And part of our issue is the laws and mandates that are in place almost universally address the individual incident. If we did this last incident would not have occurred. And all politics aside, many of those solutions wouldn't have prevented the original incident from occurring in the first place. We train, going back into law enforcement, and I totally understand and agree with, we have a difficult time training people who signed up to do this. But from a law enforcement perspective, we train them to respond to incidences. And we, as a former training officer, we train them to respond to categories of incidences, not this is what happened and this is what's happening. This is how you respond to that incident. So they understand what they need to do. And when we start looking at expectations, we're in a time right now where the vast majority of our educators have been in education since or after Columbine. So understanding that this is a response requirement and a prevention, and I'm all for prevention. And, our whole message has shifted in the last several months to prevention, and instead of just looking at response, which is a lot of what we're doing, but looking into the prevention side of it. But we also have to account for what happens when we fail to prevent. when we fail to get the proper culture, positive, supportive culture in place, when we fail to do that, or we've actually done all kinds of things to help prevent that, and it still happens. So we have to look at it from that perspective as well. I do think there is a balance point in there somewhere. I may not know what that balance point is. I do know that if we focus too much on one, the other one suffers, and then we fail at that point.
And I don't disagree with you. I think that ultimately these are having these conversations to provide to our colleagues about, okay, well, let's think through this, and what I'm all ears, and I think those of us, the best of us that are out there, are all ears, and know that we don't know all the answers, and know that we have to share these unique things, because part of what we're doing should be making each other better. And I don't think it's offensive to have tough conversations by any means. I think that when we're going to have conversations that happen about these tragedies, that we do have to have balanced conversations as it relates to it. You mentioned with law enforcement, and I think when we sit back and we explore the adequacy of what law enforcement training has been in the K-12 response arena, and it would seem in a vast majority of after action reports for tragedies that occurred in school in the K-12 space since Columbine, the same three things continue to come up, and we're not solving that problem in law enforcement: family unification, the use of a unified command system, and continuing communication during the event. And we're not solving that problem. And it's been 26, 27 years since we've introduced active shooter response to law enforcement. We continue to struggle with that. And I think that ultimately there's lots to discuss in these events, but sadly there's a reluctance at times, it would seem, to have these conversations, because you've done this for long enough. I don't think that there's too terribly many folks that are in our realm that would be willing to come on and have a conversation about a near miss tragedy, or whatever you would like to classify our events as, to have these conversations. And it's important, not just for my kids, my 28,000 kids that I'm in charge of, but for the 50 million kids that are in K-12 schools across the United States.
Here's the overarching issue that we're in, and Ethan can vouch for us, that we're trying to correct. And that is the disconnect between the mission of law enforcement and the mission of the schools. And I think, Jason, you'll agree with me here. When we start talking to law enforcement, traditional law enforcement, patrolmen on the street, the police department, that perspective, everything that they're doing in that segment of response to school shootings, school violence, is just that. How can you make my response better? And very few of them are proactively working on the other side of bang, the left side of bang, where how can I help you prevent? How can I help you with developing this partnership so that we're aware of what's happening before it happens, to the best of our ability? How do we communicate that? How do we, when something is looking like it's going to happen, how do we escalate that? And what is the response to the escalation, as opposed to what is the response to the shot being fired?
It's kind of what you were talking about before with some other students knowing about the firearm like a couple days prior. And so I think a lot of people would think, okay, this is where like a tip line or something would come in. And I think, I don't know exactly if this was the case, but let's say it was, hypothetically, if it was just a couple of friends, they're coming in and saying, hey, look at this cool thing I have, this is something to make me look cool. And right. I don't know, maybe that's the mindset, but I would think that, hey, maybe this, even if you had a tip line, I don't think they would necessarily send in a tip, because it's their friend. They're not going to rat out their friend.
And they're fourth graders.
And they're fourth graders, right? So that kind of makes me think, I'm like, okay, so how do I think back to like a personal experience. My dad was like very strict. You don't touch this unless I'm around. You always treat this as if it's loaded. This is a very dangerous thing. All the rules, right, that we learn. And so I basically learned to respect it. And it was like, if you ever see this, anywhere else, you don't touch it, and you tell an adult. And so that kind of brings me to the question of, okay, so is this something that we're trying to get parents to teach their kids more, or is there some responsibility on the school to teach these things? And it's right, you kind of touched on a little bit. It's like, how far can we go as a school to teach these things, or could you kind of get into that, like whose responsibility is it, right? And I'm generally intrigued. I don't.
They're all great questions. And here's what I'll offer. We have 2 tip lines, not just one, we have 2.
Okay, yeah.
And do I expect a 4th grader to use it? No. And let's face it, in the area that I am is where the whole stop snitching thing came from. Snitches get stitches. That came out of Baltimore City, which is 80 miles north of where we are. And I think ultimately, when it boils down to it, we have to have a conversation about social issues, which is a much broader conversation within inside of the K to 12 space,
Mm,
right? How much do we want to teach social issues? Social issues get us in a lot of trouble.
yeah.
When you look at media coverage of the K to 12 space over the last 5 to 10 years,
Oh yeah.
very little of it is about education. And a lot of it is about social issues and things that we're getting ourselves into. So there's a very large gun organization that's had arguably a very well received research based gun safety program that has been taught in schools across the United States for generations. But
Hmm.
because of the political environment, I don't know if we want to partner with somebody like that, because the message is going to get lost in who's delivering it. And I don't know where that line is, but I do know that it's a conversation that we need to have, specifically as it relates to gun violence. With what you're saying, Kelly, I think that ultimately, when we have this conversation, I think when we limit it to just gun violence, it takes away the breadth of what we need to be talking about.
Hmm.
Gun violence in itself is very, very rare within schools. We
Sure.
can't argue that. Statistically, it is very rare. But
Yeah.
when we have these conversations and we stick with them, I'm at a conference right now, sat downstairs for 2 hours, and before I came up here to do the interview, and I'm hearing nothing about school shootings in this entire conference. And as you know, when we travel around and we go to these conferences, there's a lot of discussion about school shooting. And frankly, school shootings are the least likely thing that's going to occur in a K to 12 space. Statistics show that kids are safer in K to 12 schools than they are in any other location, to include their homes, from gun violence. When we have these conversations, I think one of the ways that we limit the decision making is by simply talking about gun violence. And I think we can all agree that when we look at mastering the fundamentals of school safety, and when we look at those 4 things that our organization talks about, the strong relationships between staff and student body, positive school cultures and climates, well-trained staff and student body, and then the consistent application of your code of conduct. When we look at those things are free, but they're marathons, and they're hard, and they're not widgets, and it's not, you can't reach out and touch it on a regular basis. So it makes it very difficult to have those conversations. And when we have these tragedies or these near misses or whatever you want to call it, we tend to go straight to whatever that category of offense is. In another jurisdiction very close to us, right during the whole time, they had a stabbing. So in their community, they're talking about weapons in general, because it was a 3-inch pocket knife that got into the school, that was used after an altercation to stab a student and put him in critical condition, and he could have died in the hallway. So but if we just talk about the knife and the knife getting into the school, I think we miss the opportunity to talk about the broader picture of school safety and mastering those fundamentals of what we need to do, and building all of those layered prevention strategies that reduce the likelihood. Because I think the other thing that we miss is this: we don't have honest conversations about the idea that I can't guarantee that nothing's going to ever happen inside of a school, as much as I can't guarantee that you're not going to get in a car accident on your way to school. And when we have these conversations, the truth be told is that in the K to 12 security space, it's about risk reduction. There are very, very few things that are evidence-based solutions to what goes to how we reduce the risk within inside of school. There's even less as it relates to widgets, gadgets, and technologies that we put into place, and whether they are risk reduction strategies or they enhance response. When we talk about law enforcement responses to gun violence, we're talking about something very specific. And we all know police responses are very compartmentalized. That's the way their policy manuals are driven. If it's this, you follow this set of rules. When we talk about that, if we simply, instead of talking about the gun violence, in my opinion, talking specifically about the gun violence response, when we talk about, hey, look, we want to have an SRO program. Those SROs are going to get to know how our schools are laid out. Those SROs are going to be, they're going to be knowledgeable of our kids. We want to have a behavioral threat assessment piece. I recently was at the National School Board Association in Atlanta presenting. I had 32 or 35 different school districts in the session that we did, and less than 10% of them had behavioral threat assessment teams. We know that that's likely an evidence-based solution that reduces risk of all kinds of things inside of schools, but it also has to do with prevention of gun violence in itself. We know that having quarterly meetings or monthly meetings with our local law enforcement officials to talk about school policy, school responses, and the things that are going on inside of our schools, and sharing intelligence as it relates to the kids, our children that are having problems in school versus what's going on outside of the school, it helps enhance that understanding of where the boundary lines are, and goes over and having those exercises and things like that, that not only is going to help with gun violence response, but also major altercation response inside of a school, which are far more likely at lunch than gun violence is. So when we have these conversations, having them at a higher level, yes, we want to talk about the actual event, but I think we get lost in the discussion of, this is a gun violence issue. Well, no, it's a school security issue. And how do we reduce risk overall and concentrate on the root cause? One of the things that we've really been trying to push in our events has been talking about what that root cause is. Far too often, I think the discussion moves straight from root cause to what can we throw at this to make it work, to make it safer, or to guarantee my kids' safety.
Again, I don't disagree. The issue becomes worst case scenario. One of the reasons, and don't get me wrong, we talk about violence a lot, probably more than we should. But we also talk about, look, this is the least likely thing that's going to happen. You're more likely to have a weather event, an earthquake, all of these different things that could happen to you. But one of the things, beneficially speaking, is one of the worst and most complex things that you will deal with from an emergency management and response perspective is gun violence in your school. If you can tackle that, you can tackle just about anything else. If we're talking about gun violence just for the perspective of handling gun violence, I 100% agree. But if you look at it from a perspective of training and response and keeping your cool and understanding unified command and response and how to communicate, how to work through things, then it's a perfectly acceptable topic to be discussing. I don't want to go over it too often, but we end up talking about it quite a bit, because if you, and you touched on this, if you're doing your anti-bullying policies and programs correctly, then generally speaking, there's evidence that that will pay dividends years and years from now. If you have a good, positive, safe culture, there's evidence on that. Some of the evidence is not what it should be because there's other factors involved, like not adhering to your code of conduct and not enforcing policies and not understanding IEPs and 504s properly. There's so many things going on. Working through that is long term. And one of the reasons I think we have such a hard time dealing with the culture and the supportive environment is kids change, schools change. You go from one school to the next, even in the same district, and kids and families are so transient in nature now. They're here for a couple of years. They move to another district or another school area. And so that's a very difficult thing for schools to, or for kids to really kind of latch onto. Understanding threat assessments, understanding trigger points, understanding responses to behavior and so forth. If you understand concerning behaviors and so forth, you can understand that there are several different areas or avenues that single behavior can go. Academic risk, suicide risk, violence risk, or it could just become a non-issue. They grow out of it, right? So that's one of the things that I think we have. If we're talking about all of the different variables, there's many more variables within human behavior than there is in the emergency response and management side of things. I think we can create both. I think we can create that balance and work through that. But
I think what you mentioned is we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yep.
And I also think it's important to understand that two things can be true at once.
Yep.
And that's also been lost in the world too, right?
Yep.
That look, we can have tough conversations about what was the response less than ideal, or did they do exactly what you would expect them to do with the facts that they had in front of them? We can have those conversations while at the same time agreeing that we need to continue to master the fundamentals and concentrate on those cultures and climates. All of that can be true at once. It's not like one has to be true over the other. And what Ethan, what you were mentioning earlier about, are there ways to prevent this? And I think that leads us down a whole nother conversation of the idea that for every threat that a school faces, there are different mitigation strategies. And you can't lump them all together. And that's sadly what I see far too often is when we talk about gun violence, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, gun violence is lumped into mass shootings, community-based gun violence, shootings like we had, and then the kid who brings the gun to school because he's a drug dealer or whatever else has no intention of using it but has it for protection. Well, all four of those things are completely different.
Yeah.
And the strategies that are out there to reduce those risks or to mitigate those risks all are completely different as well. And it's not like you can throw this solution at it and it fixes all those problems. If we had that magic bullet, every one of us would buy it. And again, I think that as our profession grows and becomes more professionalized and more succinct in itself, and there's more abilities to have these outlets to have these conversations, we drive these very tough conversations that we have to have because it makes us all better. And it makes us all have to think that, I would have never thought this would happen again. And when I saw what happened in our neighboring jurisdiction, I was like, oh my God, that's horrible. I hope that never happens here. But I never walked through the idea of, well, what happens if it did happen here? Those are the learning points that come out of this. And then they just evolve from there. We get back to the exercising, the well-trained staff and student body. Do our people know what to do when bad things happen? When we talk about gun violence response, active shooter drills, and things like that, we eventually have to have a conversation with ourselves because we continue to see it in certain parts of the United States where law enforcement leads that effort. And there's people making some really bad decisions that cause all of us pain. And the fact that now we're reduced in what we can actually do when we want to do those things. Mm-hmm. And can we drill for a response? And I've made this argument before that I can have, if there is a shooting inside of a school that is an active shooter, let's say, or it's a shot that's recognized in a hallway or whatever else, the response in itself is likely to be very similar. Law enforcement is going to respond to it as though it is an active shooter, whether it's community-based or not, or whether it's domestic-based. This is the second or third active shooting in a K-12 space that I have been intimately involved with in my career. And one was a domestic-style situation and police responded to it as it was an active shooter. I've been involved in an active shooter as well in a K-12 space that was a traditional mass shooting takeover. And now I've had this. So the response to the other two is very similar, but the mitigation strategies are completely different.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we, as the professionals that do this on a regular basis, we have to be willing to have those conversations and try and break it down to people who don't do this job to understand that, when I drill active shooter drills, when I'm also drilling fire drills, in essence, I'm also drilling a piece of an active shooter drill that could be a potential and viable response to that because it is getting out of the building. So two things can happen at one time. We're doing a fire drill, but I'm also teaching my kids how to get out of the building safely, which could be a viable strategy during a takeover style attack, or locking down inside of a building could be a viable strategy in a takeover style attack, but maybe not the best strategy, but it is a strategy. I think at this point, what we have to understand is the complexities of the threats that we face on a regular basis, but also the limitations of what we have, the realities that we're dealing with as it comes to responding to all of these things. I had a conversation this morning with a gentleman from another jurisdiction. He was talking about how they had to install vape detectors in their schools, and they're really struggling with the idea of whether that was a good investment or not. And it's likely a conversation that needs to be had. And when I offered to him, well, there's another solution out there. And the other solution would be to bring back smoking lounges in the garden areas of your high schools. Would that solve the problem? It's about a viable solution as a vape detector in the bathrooms. We've never been able to solve that problem. So is spending thousands of dollars on a vape detector in a bathroom going to solve the problem any more than allowing the kids to go out into the common area or outside into the garden and smoke? There's lots of potential solutions to lots of different issues that schools face, I guess, in the end. But ultimately, being able to have these constructive conversations, I think, is the most important part of what you guys are doing and trying to do, even though, no, we can over talk just about anything, but
yeah, because
being willing to have it is important.
Because we haven't even really touched on the communication piece that you took with the community.
That's what I want to get into.
We haven't discussed problem solving abilities and really looking at gaining experience, knowledge, and skills, and using that to solve the problem with what they are faced and how they respond and those types of things. So those are conversations we can have at a later time. But
more guest appearances, Kelly?
Let's talk about the communication part quick, though.
Real quick. But as long as you're free, you're welcome.
As
long as you don't charge anything. As soon as you charge stuff, we're out. No.
It's about our kids and our kids and our staffs, man.
Right. So yeah, let's touch on the communication afterwards a little bit. So that's really interesting to me. So I want to relate this to another event that happened a little while ago. I don't know if I'm sure you probably knew about it. It was a pretty big thing in the news with Power School. So Power School had one of the largest cybersecurity data breaches that I think I've heard of, at least in K-12. And it's what they did after that was pretty incredible. So basically a good majority of the execs in that company put on a mass webinar that any of their customers could join. And they basically just laid it out. They just had that open conversation of here's what happened, here's why we think it happened, and here's what we're going to do to help, mitigate in the future, yada, yada, yada. And the reception they got from that was super positive. The fact that they were willing to have that open conversation. So I think that's why this is really important. So my question to you is, you said you had a town hall afterwards. How soon after this did you have that town hall?
So one of the standard operating procedures that we put in place is to have these town halls for our community.
Okay.
I think the word town hall is probably a little bit misleading, especially in 2025 versus 1999.
Sure.
When it comes to having town halls, as we have seen politically, politicians who go out and have town halls and they get taken over because the community believes that they are going to get to ask questions and speak. And then what those turn into is screaming sessions, and it diverts from the overall.
Yeah. Okay.
What I would say is we have moved into having community meetings versus having town halls. And you hear the word transparency all the time thrown around, and it's probably not a good word because people are sick and tired of hearing it. And nobody knows, and it's very difficult to define. In my opinion, I believe that the old adage of the truth will set you free. The truth is always coming out, and it will come out eventually one way or another. And what you are allowed legally to share at certain points is going to change over the time. However, when you can discuss the facts of the situation with the community, I think the faster you do that and the more open that you do that, the better off that you will be. And when a government organization or a company like you just mentioned does that, stands in front and says, look, we didn't do the best here. Here's what happened. Here's what we know. Here's what we're going to do about it. And here's what we need you to do about it. Those are basic crisis communication philosophies 101, right? Mm-hmm. But it's so unique and so abnormal to have that. A great example during the community meeting that we had about our event with this elementary school community was I was asked a question and my answer was, I don't know. I mean, that's the
just being honest.
Instead of trying to make something up, the answer was, I don't know.
Yeah.
And the other answer, you're of course always going to get the question, what are you going to do to guarantee my baby's safety? The truthful answer to that is, I can't. And you need to be able to say that, but also explain why that is the truth. And I think when you have those honest conversations, because let's face it, K-12 is the government. And the what is it? The 13 most famous words from when in Ronald Reagan speech, we're from the government, we're here to help. People view us as the government, and one of the things that I think K-12 struggles with across the board, just like most government entities struggle with across the board, is organizational trust and legitimacy. And in my case, as the security director for my school, I believe that as it relates to crisis response, I need to do everything that I can do to ensure that that community trust exists after the event and that our legitimacy as an organization isn't questioned. As it relates to what I'm in charge of, my circle of influence, that is a key point that I always want to make sure that I concentrate on. There are definitely situations that occur where you cannot win. There is nothing you can say or nothing you can do to turn it into a winning situation. My caveat to that is you can definitely lose more by what you do or don't do. And I think that's where when you sit down and you have these where you sit down and you plan out these events, the absence of information is going to cause people to create it. And we've seen that over and over and over again. There are far more examples of bad crisis communication than there are good. That's why when you mentioned that organization, you're shocked to hear, oh my God, they went out there and they said we screwed up. We take ownership for it. We're gonna do better. We're gonna try and fix it. And here's what happened, and here's what we're gonna do about it. When that's odd, the world's in a bad spot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it goes to show you that by going out there and just being truthful and saying what happened and being willing to have those tough conversations, it is super, super important. I told everybody in that meeting that by the end of this, there was probably going to be some people that were upset with me and that were angry with me because I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to political talk it. I'm going to tell you the truth. And we're going to agree to disagree. But the one thing that I want people to understand is this is all I do. I'm in charge of not only, I have a 10-year-old that's in that's in our school system. She's in 4th grade. So when I responded to this event, I responded to it not only as a safety director, but I also responded to it as a parent. And I'm not only in charge of the safety of my daughter, but I'm in charge of 28,000 kids. And I treat all 28,000 of those kids as precious as I do my own daughter. And by having those conversations from that point of view, I think it helps because it's the truth. And I would tell anybody, yes, we live in a litigious society. Yes, when the lawyers get involved, they're going to say, you can't talk about this, you can't talk about that. One of the questions that was brought up in our meeting that was very, very telling was we had an individual that asked, we had heard, again, community rumors, that the student had the gun because he was being bullied. The initial response from some of my colleagues was, well, we can't talk about that. We can't talk about the motive because it's protected by this or protected by that. And as I'm watching the response from the community, that is feeding into, as they're sitting there in real time, it was feeding into their belief that the reason we weren't answering the question was because what they knew was true. And I literally stopped the communication mid-sentence from one of my colleagues and said, we can't tell you what the answer is, but what you have heard and you've shared with us is simply not true. And you watched the entire feeling in the room change because they got the answer that they asked a question, they got the answer, and we were able to answer it, but we're not able to give them all the details. And that was okay in that situation. And again, I go back to the idea that when you talk with authenticity, when you talk with the truth, and when you're willing to put it out there to people, whether they like it or not, and they may disagree with the response. I mean, we can sit here and as we've had these conversations, we don't agree all the time, and think about how boring the world would be if we always did.
Yeah.
But in the end, I'll have this conversation with you guys specifically and with a select other people because I know that you know what your why is. This isn't about business. It's not about money. It's not about lining pockets. This is about making our schools safer. It's about our kids and it's about our staffs.
Yeah.
We know what our why is, and you guys share that with me. So while we might not agree with everything, I can have the same conversation with a group of very emotional parents because they hopefully can see the authenticity in the discussion that this is about our babies. It's about our staffs and it's about our communities. So that is where I think we as K to 12 in these when these critical events happen, and you can see it in press conferences. I see superintendents stand up and they're reading statements after tragedies, or that doesn't pass off emotion. It doesn't pass on the authenticity. It doesn't pass on the feeling. I started the meeting by saying I'm not only angry at what happened, I'm scared to death because that's true and it's authentic. And it matters. And that helps people to understand that while we might not agree with all the solutions, the end result that we're trying to get to, the destination we're trying to get to, is safer schools.
I agree. And it's been a long journey. It's been a frustrating journey. But I think you're right. I think once we figure out that most of us in this space, not all, but most in this space, are really trying to make our schools and thereby our communities safer. And I think that was well said. I think a lot of that has to do with communications. I think, and when I say communication, authentic communication is a must. And bringing stakeholders in and understanding and reaching out and challenging people to do their part, I think is also part of what we need to do.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we discussed, leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.